Pull up a chair and dim the light. Leave your worries at the door tonight. No need to whisper, no need to hide. We're all chasing shadows side by side. Southern moon and candle flame. Every ghost has another name. Haunted halls and forgotten dreams. Nothing's ever quite what it seems. Old photographs and dusty frames. Everybody's got stories they can't explain. Somewhere in the quiet between heartbeats, wonder waits for those who see. Did you hear it? Did you see? Tell me what you believe. Was it fate? Was it fear? Or something drawing you near? Curiosity after dark, where we wander through the strange. Every question leaves a mark. Nothing ever stays the same. Ghost stories under midnight skies. Old legends pass through lullabies. Take my hand and lose the fear. Wonder's always welcome here. Curiosity after dark, where restless hearts belong. Searching shadows for a spark, finding wonder in the unknown. Haunted mansions dressed in lace. Footsteps echo through empty space. Vampire myths and whispered lore. 100 secrets behind one door. Disney ghosts and phantom brides. Truth and fiction intertwined. The things we fear, the things we seek, have a funny way of making us believe. True crime headlines and unsolved names. The monsters hiding in familiar frames. The world is stranger than we know, and that's exactly why we go. Stories pass from friend to friend. Questions without easy ends. Somewhere between doubt and faith, we keep searching anyway. Tell me your stories, tell me your fears. Tell me the things you've carried for years. What's in the darkness? What have you seen? Tell me what keeps you wondering. Curiosity after dark, where we wander through the strange. Every question leaves a mark. Nothing ever stays the same. Ghost stories under midnight skies. Old legends pass through lullabies. Take my hand and lose the fear. Wonder's always welcome here. Curiosity after dark, where restless hearts belong. Searching shadows for a spark, finding wonder in the unknown. Maybe monsters wear familiar faces. Maybe angels leave no traces. Maybe every legend starts with someone asking, what if? Maybe myths and memories pass through generations quietly. Maybe truth is stranger still, waiting just beyond the hill. Maybe the things that keep us awake are the questions we were born to chase. Maybe wonder never dies, it just opens different eyes. So tell me what haunts you. Tell me what fascinates you. Tell me the stories you swore were true. Tell me what made you look twice. We'll talk about ghosts and graveyards, about creatures hidden in folklore, about the darkness in humanity and the beauty of not knowing. No judgment here, no need to convince anyone. You don't have to have the answers, just curiosity. Curiosity after dark, where we wander through the strange. Every question leaves a mark. Nothing ever stays the same. Ghost stories under midnight skies. The legends pass through lullabies. another story waiting to be told. Welcome to Curiosity After Dark.
Hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome back to Curiosity After Dark, the show where we separate history from legend, folklore from fact, and explore the stories that continue to haunt our imagination long after the truth has faded into the past. Tonight, we're traveling back more than 400 years to the windswept Outer Banks of North Carolina, where one of the greatest mysteries in American history began. It's a story you've probably heard pieces of before. A small English colony, a governor forced to leave for supplies, a 3-year absence, and when he finally returned, more than 100 men, women, and children vanished without a trace. No bodies, no signs of battle, no desperate message. Just one word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. For generations, that one word has inspired countless theories. Some people believe the colonists were massacred, others believe they starved to death or were captured by the Spanish. There are stories of ghosts wandering the coastline, whispers of curses, tales of supernatural disappearances, and even the occasional alien conspiracy. Roanoke has become one of the rare mysteries where almost everyone has a favorite theory. But here's the thing. History doesn't always work like a mystery novel. Over the last few decades, archaeologists, historians, and researchers have uncovered evidence that has begun to reshape how we think about the lost colony. The answer may not be as dramatic as an overnight disappearance. In fact, the truth may be far more human than legend we've been telling for centuries. Tonight, we're going to follow the evidence from the very beginning. We will look at why England wanted a colony in the New World in the first place, meet the people who risked everything to build a home on unfamiliar shores, and examine what life was really like on the edge of an untamed continent. Then we will walk through the disappearance itself, explore every major theory, from the strongest historical explanations to the most imaginative legends, and then finish by looking at what modern archaeology is revealing today. As always, my goal isn't to convince you what you believe. It's to present the history as accurately as we can, explore the stories that grew from it, and let you decide where you think the truth lies. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's travel back to the year 1587, where one small settlement on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean would become America's oldest unsolved mystery, and perhaps one of its most misunderstood. Alright, to understand why the people of Roanoke ended up on a small barrier island off the coast of present-day North Carolina, we have to go back even further than the colony itself. This story doesn't begin with missing settlers. It begins with powerful kingdoms competing for wealth, influence, and survival. Oh, why is my thing messing up now? Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Alright, so by the late 1500s, Europe was changing rapidly. Spain had become a dominant global power after Christopher Columbus's voyages at the end of the 15th century. Spanish ships returned from the Americas carrying enormous amounts of gold, silver, and other valuable resources, making Spain one of the richest nations in the world. According to historian James Horn in A Kingdom Strange, England watched Spain's success with growing concern. If England hoped to compete on the world stage, it needed colonies of its own. At the time, England was ruled by Queen Elizabeth I, Unlike Spain, England had very little experience establishing permanent settlements overseas. Instead, English explorers and private investors began looking westward, hoping to find opportunities for trade, valuable natural resources, and strategic locations that would strengthen England's position against its rivals. One of the most ambitious men pursuing that dream was Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was an explorer, writer, soldier, and a favorite of Queen Elizabeth. By 1584, the Queen granted him permission to establish an English colony in North America. It wasn't simply an act of exploration. It was a business venture, a military strategy, and a political statement all at once. No. The region Raleigh claimed was named Virginia, in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, who is often called the Virgin Queen. It's important to remember that this original Virginia was much larger than the modern state. To the English, it was a vast stretch of the Atlantic coastline that was still largely unknown to them. The location that Raleigh chose was Roanoke Island. Today, it's part of North Carolina's Outer Banks, a chain of narrow barrier islands separated from the mainland by shallow sounds and marshes. The scenery is beautiful, but can also be unforgiving. Hurricanes, shifting sandbars, dangerous inlets, and unpredictable weather have challenged sailors there for centuries. Even with modern navigation, the Outer Banks have earned the nickname the Graveyard of the Atlantic because of the thousands of shipwrecks scattered along the coast. In the 1580s, these waters were even more treacherous. But while the English viewed the region as a place to claim, it was far from empty. For thousands of years before any European ships appeared on the horizon, indigenous people have lived throughout what is now coastal North Carolina. They built communities, farmed the land, fished the sounds, hunted the forests, and maintained complex trade networks connecting neighboring nations. This was not an unexplored wilderness waiting to be settled. It was already a homeland. Turn that down a little bit now. Okay. All right. Among the indigenous communities the English encountered were the Croatoan people, who lived primarily on what is now Hatteras Island, and the Roanoke people who lived closer to the island would eventually bear their name. These communities had their own languages and had their own political alliances, rivalries, traditions, and leaders long before England had arrived. According to the National Park Service, two indigenous men become especially important to the English expedition. Manteo and Watchis. Both traveled the Atlantic to England in 1584, where they met English nobility, observed a culture unlike anything they had known, and later returned home with the explorers. Although the two men made the same journey, their experiences led them down very different paths. Mateo became one of the English's colonists' strongest allies and interpreters, believing cooperation might benefit his people. Watchis grew increasingly distrustful of the English intentions, eventually warning that the newcomers would become a threat rather than friends. History would prove that both men understood something that the English did not. The success of any colony didn't depend on England's determination alone. It would depend on relationships with people who had already called this land home. So when people think of the lost colony, they immediately think of families that disappeared in 1587. But by the time these settlers arrived, Roanoke had already been the site of a failed English colony. So in 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh launched his first attempt to establish the English presence in the New World. This wasn't meant to be a permanent community filled with families. Instead, it was a military and a exploration outpost. The men who came ashore were soldiers, sailors, craftsmen, and explorers. Their mission was to scout the region, gather information, search for valuable resources, and then prepare the way for the future settlement. The colony was led by Ralph Lane. Lane was an experienced soldier, but leading a military expedition was very different from building a thriving community. From the beginning, the colony struggled with poor planning. The settlers arrived too late in the growing season to produce enough food on their own, and they had underestimated how difficult life was on the Outer Banks. Rather than become self-sufficient, the English quickly found themselves depending on nearby indigenous communities for food and supplies. At first, many of these relationships were cooperative. The English traded with local villages and relied on the knowledge of the people who had lived in the region for generations. But that trust began to erode. Cultural misunderstandings, competing expectations, and the English demand for more food than local communities could comfortably provide created growing tension. According to historian James Horn, the English often viewed food as something they could simply request or take when supplies ran low. The indigenous communities, however, had their own families to feed and their own political concerns. Harvests were not unlimited, and generosity had its limits. As the months passed, the situation became increasingly desperate. The English were hungry, they were frustrated, and they began to suspect that local leaders were plotting against them. One of the important leaders in the region was Wingina. Wingina served as a leader of the Roanoke people and had initially welcomed the newcomers with cautious expectations. Like, kind of weary, right? But after months of conflict and growing mistrust, relations between his people and the English deteriorated rapidly. Fearing an attack, Ralph Lane decided to strike first. In June of 1586, Lane and his men launched a surprise assault on Wingina and his followers. During the attack, Wingina was killed. Modern historians generally agree that this decision was catastrophic. Any remaining trust between the English and many indigenous communities were shattered. What had begun as a fragile partnership became open hostility, making the chances of the colony, long-term survival very, very small. As if those problems weren't enough, they were still running out of food, supplies, and hope. Then, almost unexpectedly, help appeared. The famous English sea captain, Sir Francis Drake, arrived off the coast while returning from campaigns against the Spanish forces in the Caribbean. Drake offered the struggling colonists supplies, ships, and additional support. But before these plans could be fully carried out, several storms damaged several vessels and scattered parts of his fleet. Faced with worsening conditions and little confidence that the colony could survive, the settlers made a decision that seemed sensible at the time. They abandoned Roanoke. Drake carried the colonists back to England, leaving the settlement deserted. Ironically, only a few days later, another English supply ship reached Roanoke with fresh provisions. Finding the colony empty, its crew left a small detachment of approximately 15 men to maintain England's claim until another expedition could arrive. These 15 men would become important and often overlooked part of the Roanoke story. When John White's expedition reached the island in 1587, they weren't arriving at untouched land. They were returning to a place already marked by failure, violence, broken alliances, and 15 missing English soldiers whose fate was still unknown. Long before the famous disappearance, Roanoke had already become a place where plans unraveled and certainty vanished. So England's first attempt at Roanoke had ended in failure, but Sir Walter Raleigh wasn't ready to abandon his dream of establishing an English colony in North America. This time, however, the plan would be very different. Hello, plane. How are you? Instead of sending mostly soldiers and explorers, Raleigh wanted to establish a true community, one that could survive generations. The new expedition would include skilled craftsmen, farmers, women, and children. Rather than simply claiming the land for England, these settlers would build homes, raise families, and create what they hope would become a permanent English town. To lead this new colony, Raleigh appointed John White, an artist, mapmaker, and an experienced explorer who had traveled to Roanoke during the early expeditions. White wasn't a professional soldier like Ralph Lane. His detailed paintings and maps have helped introduce England to the people, plants, and landscapes of the New World. And he understood that the success of the colony would depend on diplomacy as it did on determination. I am doing fantastic. We are currently doing a thing I do every Thursday, which is Curiosity After Dark, where I find a topic that I researched for the week and discuss it. And this week is the lost colony of Roanoke. All right. So according to the National Park Service, approximately 115 men, women, and children sailed from England in the spring of 1587. Their destination, however, wasn't actually Roanoke Island. The settlers had been instructed to establish their colony further north in the Chesapeake Bay region, where English leaders believed conditions would be more favorable. The area offered better harbors, richer farmland, and greater opportunities for expansion. But the voyage did not go according to plan. The fleet's pilot, Simon Ferdinand, refused to carry the settlers any further than Roanoke Island. Historians still debate exactly why. Some believe he was eager to return to privateering against Spanish ships. Others think weather, supplies, or disagreements among the expedition leaders influenced his decision. Whatever the reason, the colonists were put ashore at Roanoke instead of their intended destination. It was an unfortunate beginning. When they arrived in July of 1587, they expected to find a small English garrison left behind from the previous year. Instead, they found almost nothing. The settlement had fallen into ruin. The houses built during the first expedition were damaged, the fortifications had deteriorated, and of the 15 English soldiers left to hold the island, only one clue remained. According to the reports recorded by John White, local indigenous people told settlers that the 15 men had been attacked and killed by warriors from neighboring groups after tensions from the earlier colony boiled over into violence. Whether every detail of that account was accurate is impossible to know, but one thing was certain. The colony was starting over from scratch. And even so, life continued. The settlers repaired buildings, planted crops, and even established a routine. They were determined to succeed where the first expedition had failed. Among the settlers was John White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare, along with her husband, Aeneas. They weren't soldiers or adventurers looking for glory. They were a young married couple hoping to build a future for their family. Only a few weeks after arriving, on August 18th, 1587, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. The baby was named Virginia Dare. Her birth was celebrated among the colony because she was the first English child known to have been born in North America. To the settlers, Virginia represented hope. She symbolized the future they believed they were building, a future where English families would thrive across the Atlantic Ocean instead of merely surviving. Today, Virginia Dare has become one of the most recognizable figures connected to Roanoke. Over the centuries, poets, novelists, playwrights, and filmmakers have transformed her into a legendary figure. Some stories have imagined she survived and was adopted by the indigenous communities. Others claim that she became a ghost, a spirit of the Carolina coast, or even the mythical White Doe said to roam the forests of the Outer Banks. These legends are fascinating, but they remain just that, legends. No historical record tells us what becomes of Virginia Dare after her grandfather left the colony. As summer turned into autumn, another problem became impossible to ignore. The settlers desperately needed supplies. Food was limited, tools were wearing out, seeds, clothing, medicine, and ammunition were all in short supply. Reluctantly, the colonists pleaded with John White to return to England. It was an impossible choice. White had no desire to leave his daughter, his son-in-law, and his newborn granddaughter or the rest of the colony behind. But he knew the dangers of the Atlantic crossing, and he also understood how uncertain life at Roanoke already was. But without fresh supplies, the colony may not survive another year. Trusting that he would return quickly, White agreed. Before he departed, he made one final arrangement with the settlers. If they ever decided to leave Roanoke, they were to carve the name of their destination into a tree or a wooden post so he could follow them. If they were forced to leave because of a danger or an attack, they were also instructed to carve an image of the Maltese cross beside the message. It was a simple plan. One word can tell him where to find them. One symbol could warn him that something had gone terribly wrong. John White sailed for England in late August of 1587, believing he would return within a matter of months. He had no way of knowing that events unfolded thousands of miles away in Europe would keep him from seeing his family again for 3 long years. So he believed that his absence was going to be brief. The plan was going to be simple. He was going to gather supplies and come back before the settlers exhausted what little they had. It wasn't the plan he wanted, but everybody understood that it was necessary. Without food, tools, clothing, seed, and ammunition, the colony had very little chance of surviving. But history had other ideas. As White crossed the Atlantic, England found itself facing the greatest military threat in its history. King Philip II of Spain had assembled what would become known as the Spanish Armada, a massive fleet of warships intended to invade England. Relations between two nations had deteriorated for years. England had supported Dutch rebels fighting against Spanish rule. English privateers like Sir Francis Drake had attacked Spanish treasure ships, and religious tensions between Protestant England and Catholic Spain only deepened the conflict. According to the National Park Service and historian James Horn, the English crown ordered nearly every seaworthy vessel to remain available for the nation's defense. Ships that might have carried supplies to Roanoke were instead needed to prepare for the possible invasion. John White pleaded for permission to return. Instead, he waited. Month after month passed with no way of him to reach his family. In 1588, the Spanish Armada finally sailed towards England. The battle that followed became one of the most defining moments in English history. Through a combination of naval tactics, smaller and more maneuverable ships, and severe storms that scattered the English fleet, England successfully repelled the invasion. For England, it was an historic victory. For the people waiting on Roanoke, it was another year without help. Even after the immediate threat had passed, England's resources remained stretched thin. Ships needed repairs, supplies were depleted, private investors who had once eagerly funded ventures became more cautious after the failure of earlier expeditions. White continued searching for a way back across the Atlantic. Finally, in 1590, 3 years after he left, he secured passage aboard 2 privateering vessels headed towards the Americas. It was far from the ideal expedition. These ships were more invested in attacking Spanish targets than delivering supplies to a struggling colony, and several delays along the journey slowed their progress. Even so, White never abandoned hope. As the North Carolina coastline came into view on August of 1590, he believed he was finally about to see his family again. There was another reason the date carried special meaning. The ships reached Roanoke Island on August 18th. Sorry, my sweet little girl wants attention. She wants attention. Okay, so it was Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. Imagine what must have been going through John White's mind as he stepped ashore. 3 years had passed, but surely his daughter, his granddaughter, and the other colonists survived. Perhaps they expanded the settlement. Perhaps children were playing between the newly built homes. Perhaps they had simply relocated nearby, waiting for supplies that he promised to bring. Instead, the settlement was silent. The houses were gone. But not burnt, not destroyed, just simply taken apart. According to John White's own journal, the buildings appeared to have been carefully dismantled rather than violently attacked. Wooden structures had been removed piece by piece. The wooden wall surrounding the settlement was still standing, suggesting that whoever left done so in an orderly fashion. There was no signs of panic, no blood, no scattered weapons, no graves, no human remains, no evidence of a desperate last stand. White immediately began searching for the signal he had arranged with the colonists before his departure. Would you lay down? Lay down. Get comfy. Lay down. Okay. On one tree, he found the words C-R-O. Then, on one of the wooden posts built into the wooden wall, he found the full word, Croatoan. C-R-O-A-T-O-A-N. It was carved neatly and cleanly into the wood. But there was no Maltese cross beside it. That detail mattered. Before leaving England, White had instructed the colonists that if they abandoned Roanoke voluntarily, they should carve the name of their destination. If they were forced to leave because of danger, they were supposed to put that cross as a warning, but there was no cross. To White, this meant that his family had likely left by choice rather than under attack. The message pointed towards Croatoan Island, which is known as the Hatteras Island. It was home to the Croatoan people, one of the indigenous groups that had maintained friendly relations with the English. White immediately wanted to sail there, convinced he might find the settlers alive. Once again, nature intervened. Strong winds, rough seas, and worsening weather prevented the ships from reaching Croatoan Island. The captains, already eager to continue their voyage, refused to risk their vessels along the dangerous Outer Banks. Reluctantly, John White turned back towards England. He never saw his daughter, his granddaughter, or any member of the Roanoke colony again. And with that, one of the greatest mysteries in American history was born. or perhaps it was simply the beginning of a story that would take centuries to understand. All right, I want to take a small breather real quick and apologize that I am not as collected as I normally am. It's been a rough day, it's been a rough week, and I have been working out in this heat. So I am scatterbrained. I wrote these notes and I was very excited to tell them to you, and then I get tongue-tied. So but we're almost there. We're almost there. Just bear with me a little bit longer, guys. All right. So for more than 400 years, people have asked the same question. What happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? It's a question that has inspired books, documentaries, TV shows, podcasts, and countless late-night debates. Theories range from the practical to the paranormal. Some are supported by historical evidence. Others rely mostly entirely on speculation. So let's examine the most common explanations. Not in any order of popularity, but in an order of how strongly the evidence that we have supports them. The first, and today the most likely accepted theory among historians, is that the colonists simply joined the Croatoan people. What's up, Snezzy? At first glance, this might not sound particularly mysterious, but when you look at the circumstances, it makes a great deal of sense. The colony had very limited food, supplies, and had no idea when or even if John White would return. The Croatoan people had remained among the friendliest indigenous communities the English encountered. Blah, blah, blah. Jesus. Okay. They already knew several of the settlers, including John White and Mateo, who had served as interpreter and an ally for years. If the colonists believed White would only be gone a few months, relocating to a nearby allied community may have seemed the safest option they could make. Remember the word that was carved into the wooden wall: Croatoan. It was not a random message. It was exactly the kind of message John White had instructed them to leave if they voluntarily relocated. And again, most importantly, there was no Maltese cross. According to White's own written account, again, that cross would have indicated if they had to leave because of danger or an attack. Its absence strongly suggests that whoever carved the message wanted White to know they had moved intentionally. Modern archaeology has added even more weight to this theory. Excavations on Hatteras Island, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, had uncovered English artifacts dating to the late 16th century, including pottery fragments, gun parts, tools, and metalworking evidence. According to archaeologist Mark Horton and a team from the Croatoan Archaeological Society, these discoveries suggest that at least some of the English settlers may have lived amongst the Croatoan people after leaving Roanoke. It's important to be careful here. These discoveries do not prove that every member of the colony survived or that even every colonist relocated together. Archaeologists generally avoid making the claims that evidence does not support. What the findings do suggest is that contact between the English settlers and the indigenous communities likely continued long after John White sailed away. Another leading theory is that the colonists split up into multiple groups. Instead of traveling together, they may have separated based on available resources, relationships with the different communities, and simple necessity. This idea gained attention after several researchers studying one of John White's original maps discovered what appeared to be a concealed symbol beneath a patch of paper. Hidden underneath was an outline of what looked like a small fort, located further inland. Sorry. For some reason, my brain stumbled for a second. The discovery prompted new archaeological investigations at the site known as Site X. While several 16th century English artifacts have been recovered there, archaeologists remain divided over what those objects actually mean. Some believe that they indicate a small group of the Roanoke settlers relocated inland. Others argue that the artifacts could have arrived through trade or later activity. So while the hidden fort theory is intriguing, the evidence remains incomplete. The next possible is one many early historians favored, which was starvation. Tree ring studies conducted have revealed that Roanoke colony was established during one of the most severe droughts in the region in nearly 800 years. According to research published in the journal Science, the drought lasted from 1587 through 1589, the exact period where the settlers were struggling to survive. See, I cannot read my own sentences to save my life. Crop failures would have affected everyone. The English could not grow enough food. Local indigenous communities could have also faced food shortages. That makes it so much harder to rely on trade because people naturally prioritize feeding their own family during times of scarcity. It's entirely possible that some colonists died from hunger or disease before the survivors relocated elsewhere. Another theory argues that the settlers were likely killed by neighboring groups. This has some historical basis, has some historical basis. I'm telling y'all, for some reason, I can't even read my own notes. And what I mean by notes is I literally have like a research paper like typed up stuff. Because I like doing research. Anyway, so relations between the English and several local communities had deteriorated dramatically after Ralph Lane's expedition killed Wingina back in 1586. That violence created lasting resentment. Years later, Chief Powhatan, the leader of the Powhatan Confederacy in present-day Virginia, reportedly told English settlers that Jamestown that he had ordered the attacks against Europeans living further south. Some historians have wondered whether these statements referred to the survivors of Roanoke. However, there are significant problems with this theory. If the colony had completely been destroyed in a violent attack before John returned, he would have found evidence of that. Hey! Lay down. Lay down. He would have found evidence of that. So he would have found the burnt buildings, the broken weapons, human remains, mass graves. Instead, White describes the settlement as appearing to have been dismantled carefully and deliberately. That doesn't completely rule out violence occurred, but it makes a sudden massacre at Roanoke itself much less likely. Another explanation is disease. The colonists faced an enormous number of health risks. Poor nutrition weakened their immune systems, contaminated water could spread illness. European diseases affected the indigenous populations, while settlers also encountered unfamiliar diseases on their own. Without trained physicians or adequate medicine, even relatively common infections would have become deadly. Disease almost certainly claimed lives within the colony. The question is whether it explains the disappearance of everyone. Most historians think it explains part of the story, not all of it. And then we arrive at the theories that have made Roanoke famous in pop culture. Ghosts, curses, witches, time slips. dimensional portals, alien abductions. Entire books have been written suggesting the colony vanished into another world. Paranormal investigators have reported strange lights, mysterious voices, and unexplained figures near Roanoke Island. Some local legends claim that the spirit of the missing settlers still wander the Outer Banks searching for home. They're fascinating stories. They're entertaining stories. But that's just it. They're stories. For more than 400 centuries, there is no credible historical or archaeological evidence supporting supernatural explanations for what happened to the colony. That doesn't make folklore unimportant. In many ways, these legends tell us just how much about ourselves they do Roanoke. Human beings are naturally uncomfortable with unanswered questions. When history leaves gaps, imagination often rushes in to fill them. That's probably why Roanoke has remained such a powerful mystery. Not because we have no evidence, it's because we have just enough evidence to keep asking new questions. And let's be honest right here, okay? For centuries, the entire story of Roanoke has been built almost based on one account. Like, we've heard the story just pretty much from one man, and that's John White and his journal. Beyond that, there were very few written records. There was no letters from the colonists, no diaries, no official report explaining what happened after White sailed away. For hundreds of years, historians had to simply work with what little they had. But archaeology has a way of telling stories that written history cannot. Every piece of broken pottery, every rusted nail, every fragment of glass or iron pulled from the ground has the potential to answer questions that might have remained unanswered for generations. In recent decades, archaeologists have returned to Roanoke and the surrounding islands with modern technology, careful excavation techniques, and a simple goal: to follow the evidence wherever it leads. One of the most important areas of research has been the Hatteras Island, the modern name for the island that was once known as Croatoan. Now, again, remember, that's the word that was written into the wooden wall, right? That was written into the wooden post. So, again, if the colonists left voluntarily, that would be one of the first places we would expect to find evidence. Now, according to archaeologist Mark Horton and research conducted by the Croatoan Archaeology Society, the excavations on Hatteras Island have uncovered several English artifacts dating back to the 16th century. These pieces include pottery known as borderware, fragments of firearms, iron tools, writing slates, and evidence that European-style metalworking took place on the island. However, none of these discoveries prove that every member of the lost colony settled there, but together they paint an interesting picture. These aren't isolated trade goods. Some of the artifacts suggest that English people may have been living among the Croatoan community long enough to repair equipment, manufacture tools, and adapt to everyday life. Instead of imagining two completely separate societies, archaeologists increasingly picture something that was much more complicated. People living together, learning from one another, sharing skills necessary for survival. Another major effort has focused on something called the Lost Colony Map, which is often referred to as the La Virginia Powers Map. This remarkable map was drawn by John White himself during his time in North America. Several years ago, conservators examining the original noticed something unusual. A small patch of paper was placed over part of the map. Remember that little spot that I mentioned earlier? So, When modern imaging techniques allowed the researchers to look beneath that patch without damaging it, they discovered an outline of what appeared to be a small fort hidden underneath. This discovery sparked enormous excitement. Could John White have secretly marked a planned relocation site? The researchers with the First Colony Foundation began excavating an area in northeastern North Carolina that has become known as simply Site X. There, archaeologists have recovered a handful of artifacts that appeared consistent with the late 16th century English occupation, including fragments of English ceramics and other objects that date to roughly the same period as the Roanoke colony. It's an intriguing discovery, but it's one that historians approach carefully because the number of artifacts are relatively small. Some experts argue that they represent members of the lost colony. Others believe they could have arrived later through trade or just later on when more English came over. At this point, the evidence is promising, but it isn't conclusive. And that's one of the most important lessons archaeology teaches us. Science rarely works by proving a mystery overnight. Instead, each discovery adds another small piece to a much larger puzzle. Researchers have explored whether DNA might someday help solve the mystery. Over the years, families in North Carolina have claimed descent from the lost colony, while some indigenous communities have oral traditions describing ancestors who welcomed English settlers into their villages. In theory, comparing genetic evidence between modern descendants and historical remains could provide valuable answers. In practice, though, it's far more complicated because very few confirmed remains from the original colonists exist for comparison. And after more than 400 years of migration, intermarriage, and population movement, tracing direct ancestry is extraordinarily difficult. For now, DNA has raised interesting possibilities, but has not provided definitive proof. Perhaps the biggest change over the last few decades wasn't a single discovery. It was a change in how historians ask the question. For generations, people have asked, where did the colonists appear? Today's researchers are asking something different. How did they survive? That shift changes everything. Instead of imagining one dramatic event that erased an entire community overnight, historians now consider the possibility that there is never one single answer. It could have been all of them. Some colonists could have joined the Croatoan people. Some may have moved inland. Some may have died from disease or starvation. Children could have grown up learning the indigenous languages. Families may have been blended into communities that have already been living there for centuries. If that's what happened, then perhaps the lost colony isn't truly lost at all. It just simply stopped being an English colony. And that possibility may be more remarkable than any ghost story ever. So, we've been talking about this the entire time. And we only got all of this because John White stood in an abandoned settlement reading a single word carved into weathered wood. And that's fascinating. Roanoke has become far more than a historical event. It has become a cultural phenomenon. Over the centuries, writers, filmmakers, historians, and storytellers have returned to the lost colony again and again, each offering their own explanation of what happened. Some stories imagine that the settlers were wiped out in one single violent attack. Others transform Virginia Dare into a figure. One of the oldest legends claims that she survived the colony's disappearance, but was later transformed into a beautiful white doe by a powerful spirit. According to the legend, only someone who truly loved her could break the spell. It's a story rooted in regional folklore rather than documented history, but has become one of North Carolina's best-known legends. Television has embraced this mystery. If you've watched American Horror Story Roanoke, then you know the series presents the colony as the center of a supernatural terror, combining ghosts, witches, ancient curses, and paranormal creatures. It's entertaining television, but it's important to remember that it isn't meant to reflect the historical record. The Lost Colony has also appeared in countless novels, documentaries, podcasts, such as this one, video games, and fictional investigations. Nearly every version asks the same question, but each arrives at a different answer. And that raises another question. Why? Why has Roanoke endured while so many other colonial failures have faded into history? Part of the answer is simple. Human beings do not like unfinished stories. Most historical events eventually reach some kind of conclusion. We know how battles ended, we know who won elections, we know where famous explorers died. Even tragedies usually leave behind evidence that allows us to reconstruct what happened. But Roanoke doesn't, or at least it doesn't seem to. For generations, all anyone knew was more than 100 people had disappeared from historical record. The empty space invited imagination. The evidence is limited. Myths began to grow in the silence. Sometimes these myths become more famous than history themselves, than the history itself. But I think there's another reason why Roanoke continues to fascinate us. It reminds us that history isn't complete. We sometimes imagine history as a finished book, as though every important question has already been answered. But the truth is so very different. Archaeologists are still making discoveries, historians are still translating old documents. New technology allows researchers to examine artifacts and maps in ways that weren't possible even 20 years ago. Every excavation has the potential to rewrite part of the story. History isn't standing still, it's still being uncovered. And that is one of the reasons I love topics like this. The mystery of Roanoke doesn't survive because historians have stopped looking. It survives because they haven't. Every generation asks new questions. Every generation brings new tools. Every generation gets a little closer to understanding what really happened. Maybe, someday, archaeologists will uncover a settlement that leaves no room for doubt. Maybe they'll find written records that finally answer the questions John White could never. Or maybe the complete story has been lost forever, scattered by time, storms, and centuries of changing landscapes. If that's the case, perhaps that's okay, because sometimes the value of history isn't found in the answers. It's found in the search itself. So as we began tonight, I told you that this was one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries. After looking at the evidence, I'm not sure that's entirely true anymore. I don't think the mystery is whether the colonists vanished into thin air. The evidence simply doesn't support that. I think the real mystery is much more personal. Which families survived? Which children grew up in indigenous communities? What traditions were shared? Whose names were forgotten? How many descendants might be living ordinary lives today, never realizing that their family story stretches back to one small community on the edge of the Atlantic? Those are the questions worth asking. And Roanoke reminds us that history isn't always about kings and queens and famous battles. Sometimes it's about ordinary people facing impossible circumstances. Parents trying to protect their children. Neighbors helping one another survive. Communities adapting to a world that changed faster than anyone expected. Maybe the lost colony was never truly lost. Maybe it simply became something different. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson Roanoke has to offer. Thank you so much for spending your evening with me on Curiosity After Dark. I hope tonight's episode reminded you that some of history's greatest mysteries aren't solved by believing the most extraordinary explanation. They're solved by patiently following the evidence wherever it leads. Until next time, stay curious and have a wonderful night. All right, guys, so that is the end for today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Let's see. So next week is going to be a bonus because we have 5 weeks in this month. So I don't have a topic picked out yet. So I will take a poll, or not really a poll. If you have an idea or if there's a topic that you want me to cover, please let me know. You can leave it in the comments. You can talk to me on YouTube, Instagram, Threads, TikTok, any place that has my social media. Like, let me know. And I will see you on Curiosity After Dark next week with a brand new episode. Until then, I hope y'all stay curious. Now it's time for me to go play some Marvel Rivals and relax for the night. So, love you guys and good night.